69 years on this earth, and nobody had ever made me feel small the way my own son did on a Friday night in Manhattan. Not my first boss, who told me I'd never amount to anything. Not the bank that rejected my first loan application 3 times. Not even my ex-wife Sandra, who left me for her spin instructor and had the audacity to keep the dog. Not the cardiologist who told me at 52 that my heart needed to slow down. Not the business partner who stole my client list in 1987 and shook my hand at the door on his way out. Nobody. Not once. Not in 69 years. Until Jordan. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The gala was his idea, naturally. Jordan Price, my son, my blood, my greatest achievement and my most confusing disappointment, had organized a charity fundraiser at the Meridian, one of those impossibly elegant venues on Park Avenue where the chandeliers cost more than most people's cars, and the waitstaff look at you like they graduated from a better university than you did. $600 a plate, 200 guests, black tie, the whole thing. He'd called me 3 weeks earlier, voice dripping with the particular brand of enthusiasm he reserved for things that benefited him directly. Dad, you have to come. It's going to be incredible. I need my family there. I should have known then. Jordan didn't need people. Jordan needed audiences. But he was my son. So I pressed my good suit, the navy one Sandra always said made me look distinguished, shined my shoes, took the subway from my apartment in Queens because I still refused to pay Manhattan parking prices on principle, and walked into the Meridian at 7:15 on a Friday evening, feeling, if not exactly proud, at least present. The room was stunning, I'll give Jordan that. Crystal everywhere. Soft gold lighting. A string quartet in the corner playing something that probably had a French name. 200 of New York's most self-congratulatory citizens, sipping champagne and telling each other how generous they were for showing up. I found my seat, table 14, which I later realized was the farthest table from the stage, and introduced myself to the people around me. A couple from Westchester, a real estate developer from Brooklyn, a woman named Patricia who kept checking her phone and sighing loudly. Normal people. My kind of people. Jordan found me during cocktail hour, shook my hand like I was a colleague, and said, Dad, you look great. Glad you could make it, before someone more important appeared over my shoulder and pulled him away mid-sentence. I raised this man, I thought. I packed his lunches. I drove him to school in the rain. I co-signed his first apartment lease. I sat in hospital waiting rooms alone at 2 a.m. when he was 7 years old, and running a fever that scared me more than anything I've experienced before or since. And he shook my hand. I had a glass of wine, then another. Ate the bread because at 69 I've earned the right to eat the bread without apology. Listened to 3 speakers talk about youth entrepreneurship programs in underserved communities, which was genuinely moving and made me briefly forget that I was sitting at table 14 like an afterthought in my own son's story. Then Jordan took the stage. He looked incredible up there, I won't lie. Tall, sharp in his tuxedo, the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without asking permission. He got that from me, actually, though I suspected he'd stopped believing that a long time ago. The crowd loved him immediately. He told 2 jokes, both landed. He spoke about the foundation with real passion, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is the Jordan I raised. Maybe. And now, Jordan said, grinning at the crowd like he was about to reveal something delightful, we're going to do something a little different tonight. The room leaned in. How many of you have a dad? Laughter, hands raised. How many of you have a boring dad? More laughter, more hands. I smiled politely at no one in particular. Well, Jordan said, loosening slightly, warming to the performance the way he always did when a crowd gave him an inch. I brought mine tonight. He pointed directly at me. 200 heads swiveled toward table 14 like a single organism. Stand up, Dad. Oh no, I stood. Because what else do you do when 200 people are looking at you, and your son is holding a microphone and grinning like he invented comedy? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Eugene Price, retired, Queens, New York. Loves the History Channel, goes to bed at 9:30, and once described a trip to Home Depot as, and I quote, a pretty exciting Saturday. The room erupted. Real laughter. Warm laughter, the kind that thinks it's harmless because it doesn't know any better. I stood there and smiled because 69 years had taught me that sometimes smiling is the only dignified option available to you. I smiled the way you smile when something costs you more than you're willing to show. So here's what we're going to do, Jordan continued, eyes bright with the performance of it all. We are going to auction off an evening with my boring dad. Dinner for two, on the foundation. Who wants my boring dad? We'll start the bidding at $1, because honestly, he paused for the joke, timing it perfectly. That felt generous. The room lost it completely. Someone at table 3 shouted, $1, and the crowd cheered. Jordan pointed at them like a game show host who had never been happier in his life. $1. Do I hear 2? Silence. More laughter. I was still standing, still smiling. Somewhere in my chest, something very old and very quiet was making a decision. Going once, Jordan said theatrically. And then it happened. From the back of the room, Table 1, the table I had noticed earlier, the table closest to the exit, where a silver-haired man in a dark suit had been sitting with the stillness of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. A voice cut clean through the laughter like a blade through paper. $1 million. The room didn't just go quiet. It stopped. 200 people, mid-laugh, mid-breath, mid-sip, stopped. The string quartet, who had been warming up in the corner for the post-dinner set, stopped. I'm fairly certain the chandelier above table 7 stopped swinging. Jordan's grin didn't disappear immediately. It took about 3 seconds, which felt, in that silence, like considerably longer. His mouth stayed in the shape of a smile while the rest of his face tried to catch up with what his ears had just heard. I'm sorry, Jordan said into the microphone, his voice doing something I had never heard it do before, cracking slightly. Did someone say, $1 million? The man said again, same volume, same tone, unhurried, final. The voice of a man who was not accustomed to repeating himself, and was doing so only as a courtesy. He was already standing, silver-haired, dark suit, no tie, late 60s, maybe early 70s. The kind of man who takes up exactly the amount of space he occupies and not 1 inch more, which paradoxically makes every eye in the room find him immediately. I didn't know who he was yet. I want to be clear about that. I, Eugene Price, 69 years old, standing at table 14 in a navy suit with my dignity hanging by a thread, had absolutely no idea who this man was, or why he had just offered $1 million for dinner with me. But I looked at him, and he looked at me, and something passed between us that I couldn't name then, and still find difficult to describe now. A kind of recognition between two men who have spent their lives being underestimated, and have learned to be very, very patient about it. Jordan recovered. Barely. We have $1 million, he said into the microphone. His voice had lost the game show host quality entirely. Sold. To the gentleman at table 1. I sat down. Patricia from table 14 had stopped sighing and was staring at me with an expression I can only describe as profound reassessment. The real estate developer from Brooklyn was looking at me like he wished he'd introduced himself more thoroughly during cocktail hour. The couple from Westchester were leaning toward each other, whispering. I picked up my wine, took a slow sip. 69 years, I thought. Not once. But now I was curious. I was very, very curious. The evening continued in a different atmosphere entirely. The energy in the room had shifted. The comfortable, self-congratulatory warmth replaced by something more electric, more uncertain. People kept glancing between me and table 1. Jordan delivered the rest of his program with slightly less swagger than he'd started with, which I noted and said nothing about. After the formal program ended, as guests began moving toward the bar and each other, the silver-haired man made his way across the room toward table 14. People parted for him without quite realizing they were doing it. That's a particular kind of presence, the kind you can't manufacture, and can't buy, and can't learn from a book. He stopped at my table, looked down at me. Eugene Price, he said, not a question. That's right, I said. He extended his hand. Maurice Parker. I shook it. And even in the noise and electricity of that room, I felt the name land somewhere significant in my chest. Because even in Queens, even a 69-year-old retired man who goes to bed at 9:30, even I knew that name. Maurice Parker, founder of Parker Capital Group. The kind of private equity firm that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Forbes covers, declined interviews, the kind of wealth so settled it had stopped being interesting to the people who had it. That Maurice Parker, I believe we have a dinner to schedule, he said. Apparently we do, I said. He almost smiled. I'll have my assistant call you tomorrow. He handed me a card, cream-colored, minimal, just his name and a number, and walked away through the crowd, which continued parting for him without quite realizing it. I looked at the card. Then I looked across the room at Jordan, who was watching me from beside the stage with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before. It was the expression of a man who has just realized he may have fundamentally misread a situation. Good, I thought. Sit with that. I took the subway home to Queens, sat in my kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, turned the card over in my hands, and I thought, what exactly does Maurice Parker want with a boring old man from Queens? I didn't know yet, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. Maurice Parker's assistant called at 8:15 the next morning. Her name was Sharon. She had the composed, efficient energy of someone who had spent years being the first line of defense between the world and a very important man, and she was extraordinarily good at her job. We scheduled breakfast for the following Monday, a place on the Upper East Side. No sign outside, menu with no prices. I wore the navy suit again. Maurice was already seated when I arrived. Dark suit, no tie. Same stillness from the gala. The stillness I now recognized as the particular quality of a man who had long ago stopped needing to perform anything for anyone. He stood when I approached, shook my hand, firmly, briefly, with eye contact. Eugene. Maurice. We sat. Coffee appeared without either of us asking. I decided immediately that I liked this place. I'll be direct, Maurice said, wrapping both hands around his cup. I don't enjoy wasting time, mine or anyone else's. Neither do I said. Good. He studied me for a moment with the focused attention of a man accustomed to evaluating things quickly and accurately. Then I'll start with a name. Mitchell Green. I put down my coffee. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 11 years. Mitchell Green, my oldest friend. My college roommate at Howard University in 1974, when we were both broke and ambitious and absolutely certain the world owed us something, which it did not. But we were young and entitled to the illusion. He had sat across from me in a diner on 45th Street, 31 years ago, with a paper napkin covered in numbers, and the particular expression of a man who has run out of options, but not out of belief. Eugene, I need $50,000 and 6 months. That's all I need. I've been everywhere. Nobody will touch it. But I know this works. I know it like I know my own name. I had looked at the napkin. I had looked at Mitchell, and I had thought, this man has never lied to me in 30 years of friendship. Not once. I gave him both. Quietly. No contract. No equity agreement. No lawyers. Just a handshake and a $50,000 wire transfer from an account Sandra didn't know existed, because Sandra would have said I'd lost my mind, and she would not have been entirely wrong, and I didn't want to have that argument because I already knew what I was going to do. 6 months later, Mitchell Green's logistics company had its first major contract. A mid-sized manufacturer in New Jersey that needed a supply chain solution nobody else had thought to build the way Mitchell had built it. 2 years after that, his second contract. Then a third. Then a fourth that was so large it required Mitchell to hire 47 people in 3 months. By the time Mitchell sold his firm 15 years ago, a transaction that made the front page of the Wall Street Journal's business section and generated a number I still find difficult to say out loud, he was worth $380 million. I was living in Queens, retired, watching the History Channel. We had an agreement, Mitchell and I, established long before the success arrived. He'd offered to repay me 100 times over the years. I'd refused every time. Not out of stubbornness. Well, not entirely out of stubbornness. But because what I'd given him wasn't a loan. It was a bet on a friend. And I had never once needed the world to know I'd made that bet or that I'd won it. Mitchell told me about you 6 years ago, Maurice said. We were putting together the early investor structure for what became Parker Clean Infrastructure Fund. Mitchell was our second major investor. He made it a condition, not a request, a condition, that before we finalized anything, we locate a man named Eugene Price in Queens, New York, and make him an offer. I said nothing. He told me, Maurice continued, that there was a man who had funded his entire operation on nothing but instinct and friendship, and $50,000. He told me this man had never asked for a single thing in return, not recognition, not repayment, not even a mention. Maurice paused. He told me you were the most quietly powerful man he'd ever met. Mitchell always did talk too much, I said. Maurice smiled. First smile I'd seen from him. It looked good on him, unhurried, genuine, like everything else about him. He also told me, Maurice said, that if I ever met you, I should pay attention, that you were the kind of man who said more by saying nothing than most people say in a lifetime. Mitchell is very generous, I said. Mitchell is very accurate, Maurice said. I watched you last Friday night. The entire room was laughing, and you sat in that chair like a man who knew something nobody else in the room knew. He held my gaze. I've spent 50 years doing business in rooms full of the most powerful people in this country. I know that look. It's the look of a man who has been underestimated so many times that he stopped being bothered by it and started being interested in it. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. What exactly are you offering, Maurice? I said. He slid a folder across the table. 15% equity stake in Parker Clean Infrastructure Fund. No capital required from you. Your contribution happened 31 years ago. Mitchell's investment, which seeded a significant portion of our initial raise, traces directly back to that $50,000 wire transfer you sent him in 1993. Without that, none of what followed happens. The fund acknowledges that. He nodded at the folder. The numbers are in there. I looked at the folder. Didn't open it yet. Why didn't Mitchell call me himself? I said. Because, Maurice said. He was afraid you'd say no out of stubbornness. Fair, I thought. He's not wrong, I said. He usually isn't, Maurice said. Open the folder, Eugene. I opened the folder. I didn't expect the specific figure printed on the first page. What I will tell you is that it had enough zeros to make a 69-year-old man from Queens sit very still for a very long time and reconsider every decision he'd ever made that had led to this exact moment in this exact room with no prices on the menu. I closed the folder. I need to think about it, I said. Of course, Maurice said. And I need to understand, I said carefully, why you stood up at that gala. You could have called. You had my name. You had the connection through Mitchell. You didn't need to bid $1 million in front of 200 people. Maurice was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his coffee. Because, he said finally, your son put you in that chair and handed a room full of people permission to laugh at you. And I watched you absorb it with more dignity than I have seen any man display in 50 years of business. He looked up, and I thought, Mitchell was right, and I wanted your son to see it, to see that the man he just called boring had someone in that room who knew exactly who he was. I nodded slowly. Consider it, Maurice said. An opening statement. We finished breakfast. I took the folder home to Queens. Read every page 3 times. Called my accountant, a careful and conservative man named Harold, who had never in 30 years of managing my modest finances said anything remotely excitable. Harold said, Eugene, please, say yes. I called Maurice the next morning. I'll do it, I said. One condition. Name it. My son has been trying to get a meeting with Parker Capital for 2 years, I said. I know because he mentioned it at Thanksgiving, then again at Christmas. Both times I pretended not to hear. I don't want you to take that meeting, I said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's your business decision. But I want him to know why. And Maurice, a long pause. Eugene, Maurice said, and I could hear something in his voice that might have been admiration and might have been anticipation and was almost certainly both. Yes, I think that can be arranged. 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in October, I put on the Navy suit for the 3rd time. It was becoming my lucky suit. Sandra would have hated that. Jordan had called me the previous Sunday. Casual voice, Sunday voice, the voice he used when he was trying to extract something without appearing to extract it. Dad, hey, random question. You know Maurice Parker, Parker Capital Group? I said, which is not a lie. It is simply a sound. I've been trying to get a sit-down with his team for 2 years. Nobody gets through. Literally nobody. But I heard through a contact that he's been active lately, taking meetings, and I just thought... Jordan paused. You don't know anyone who might know him, do you? Like from your old network or whatever. Can't think of anyone, I said pleasantly. Right. Yeah. Long shot. A beat. Hey, you should come to dinner soon. I feel like I haven't properly seen you since. He stopped himself. He knew since when. Just soon, okay? Not anger. Anger had long dissolved. Somewhere between the Upper East Side and Harold saying words he'd never said before. Not satisfaction. Not yet. What I felt was patience. The specific, deliberate, finely aged patience. of a man who has been quiet for 6 decades and has finally, carefully, decided to speak. Maurice had designed the meeting with the precision of a man who understood that the architecture of a moment matters as much as the moment itself. Jordan had been corresponding with a junior associate at Parker Capital for 3 weeks. A carefully managed exchange that gave Jordan just enough hope to show up prepared, just enough uncertainty to make him nervous, and just enough prestige to make him bring 2 of his board members. He apparently spent the morning of the meeting telling his assistant, Renee, that this was the most important meeting of his career. Renee, who I had met once at Christmas, and who had given me her card and said with complete sincerity, "Mr. Price, your son mentions you more than he realizes," had texted me that morning. "He's nervous," she wrote. "He picked his outfit last night." I arrived at Parker Capital's offices on 6th Avenue at 9:15, 43rd floor, the kind of view that makes you feel the city was arranged specifically for your benefit. Sharon, Maurice's assistant, met me at the elevator. "Mr. Price." She was composed, efficient, excellent. "Mr. Parker will bring you in at the right moment. There's coffee in the side room." "Thank you, Sharon." She paused at the door of the side room. "Mr. Price, Mr. Parker told me what this meeting is about." She allowed herself the smallest, most controlled smile I have ever seen on a professional's face. "I've worked for him for 11 years. I have never seen him enjoy preparing for something this much." She left. I sat in the side room with my coffee and listened. Jordan arrived at 9:30. I heard him in the corridor, bright, performance ready, the particular voice he deployed when he needed something from someone important, warmer than his regular voice, slightly faster. The voice of a man who has rehearsed. "This space is extraordinary, really. We've admired everything Parker Capital has built. The infrastructure fund especially, the vision behind that, is just remarkable. I raised this man, I thought. I built this moment. Maybe those 2 things are not unrelated." The meeting began. Maurice's voice through the wall, measured, unhurried, genuinely curious about Jordan's foundation, its structure, its goals, its funding model. Jordan answered well. "I want to be honest about that. My son is genuinely talented." He spoke with intelligence and clarity and real passion about the work his foundation was doing in underserved communities. And I felt the familiar, complicated pride that has followed me through 35 years of fatherhood. The pride that sits right next to the grief of being misunderstood by the person you're proudest of. 22 minutes into the meeting, Maurice said, "Before we go further, there's someone I'd like to bring in. He's been involved in our fund from the beginning, and I think his perspective would be valuable here." A pause. "Of course," Jordan said. I heard the pause in his voice, the slight recalibration. "Who else is coming?" Sharon opened the side room door, nodded at me. I stood, straightened my jacket, picked up my briefcase, the old leather one Sandra always hated, the one I've carried for 22 years because it's been everywhere with me and I see no reason to change. I walked into the conference room. What happened to Jordan Price's face in the 4 seconds that followed is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, and I intend to live considerably longer just to keep carrying it. First, recognition. That's my father. Then, confusion. Why is my father here? Then, the beginning of recalibration, the mental arithmetic starting, the adding up of things that hadn't seemed connected before. Maurice Parker knows my father. And then, the 4th expression, the one underneath all the others, the one that a performer tries to suppress and cannot quite manage, the dawning, stomach-dropping, foundation-shifting understanding that something has been happening that he did not know about, that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he thought it was. "Dad," Jordan said. His voice came out at about half the volume he intended. "Jordan," I said, the way I'd said it every Sunday for 35 years, pleasantly. Without drama, I sat down across from my son. Maurice sat at the head of the table, and then the door opened one more time, and Mitchell Green walked in, my oldest friend, my college roommate. The man I hadn't seen in 11 years, who had flown in from Chicago the previous evening, and who had hugged me in the corridor for a long, wordless moment that said everything that needed to be said between 2 old friends who had watched each other become who they were going to be. Mitchell sat to Maurice's right and looked at Jordan with the calm, assessing gaze of a man worth $380 million, who remembered being worth nothing. Jordan looked at Mitchell. I watched him recognize the name. I watched him understand that the man who had built one of the most successful logistics companies in American history in the last 30 years was sitting across from him. I watched him begin, slowly, painfully, like a man reading a map upside down and then turning it right side up, to understand the shape of what he was looking at. Jordan, Maurice said, folding his hands on the table with the quiet authority of a man who had run 10,000 meetings and knew exactly how this one was going to go. I want to be transparent with you, because I believe transparency is important, and because I think you deserve to understand the full picture of what this meeting is. Jordan nodded. The performance had left his face entirely. What remained was just my son, 35 years old, suddenly looking younger. Your father and I are partners, Maurice said. 15% equity stake in Parker Clean Infrastructure Fund. That partnership was finalized 6 weeks ago. He let that sit. It was established because of a decision your father made 31 years ago, a decision that I won't detail unless he chooses to. That is foundational to everything this fund is built on. That is not a word I use loosely or generously. It is the accurate word. Silence. Jordan turned to me. Dad, let him finish, I said gently, but firmly enough. I also want you to know, Maurice continued, that your foundation's work is genuine and your proposal is strong. Your team has done serious work, and under different circumstances, this would be a different conversation. A pause. The specific pause of a man who has chosen his next words with great care. But I've been aware of your outreach to Parker Capital for 2 years, and I made a decision not to take that meeting. I want you to understand why, because I think you've earned that explanation. Jordan was completely still. His 2 board members, whom I had met approximately 90 seconds ago, were sitting with the particular frozen quality of people who have realized they are witnessing something private and have no exit. The night I met your father, Maurice said, I watched a 69-year-old man be placed in a chair on a stage in a room full of people he'd never met by his own son and made into a punchline. And I watched him absorb every second of it, with more dignity and more grace than I have witnessed any person display in 50 years of business. Maurice's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. I don't do business with people who can't recognize the value of what's in front of them, and I don't make exceptions to that. The room was so quiet I could hear the city 43 floors below. Mitchell Green was looking at the table. His jaw was moving very slightly, the way it always had when he was trying not to smile. Jordan's eyes were wet. My son, who could perform anything, was not performing now. His jaw worked silently. Dad. Just the word. Stripped of everything else. I didn't. I had no idea. I know you didn't, I said. It was supposed to be funny. I wasn't trying to. Jordan. I leaned forward, looked at my son, really looked at him the way I used to when he was small and frightened and needed someone to tell him the true shape of things. I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, and not the way it might sound. He waited. I have never needed you to know what I do quietly, I said. I didn't give Mitchell that money for recognition. I didn't spend 31 years turning down repayment because I wanted to be discovered. I did those things because that is who I am. Quiet, patient, content to let the work speak from a distance. I held his eyes, but I am 69 years old, and I sat in that chair, and 200 people laughed, and you pointed at me and called me boring in a room full of strangers, and it cost me something I am not going to pretend it didn't cost me. Jordan's jaw was tight. His eyes were full. So here is what's going to happen, I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket. I am going to go home to Queens. I am going to find something at Home Depot genuinely interesting. And you are going to sit with this. I looked at him steadily. Not as punishment, as information. About who your father is. About what quiet looks like when it's actually been paying attention all along. I picked up my briefcase. Your foundation is good work, Jordan. Real work. Keep doing it. I straightened my cuffs. But you'll need to find your own investors. That's not cruelty. That's just the correct thing. I reached across the table and put my hand on my son's shoulder. Briefly, firmly. The way fathers do when they love someone and are also furious with them and don't have words for both at once. Then I shook Maurice's hand. And I hugged Mitchell Green. Properly, the way you hug a man you've known for 50 years. In front of whoever is watching. Because at 69 years old, I hug my friends, and I don't apologize for it. 50 years, Mitchell said quietly into my shoulder. 50 years, I said. I let go, picked up my briefcase, walked to the door. Eugene? Maurice said. I turned. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it once before. at table 1 on a Friday night at the Meridian, when he had turned from watching my son and looked at me across a room full of laughing people. Quiet respect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Dinner Friday," he said. "Only if there are no prices on the menu," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Obviously. I walked out. I took the elevator down 43 floors, walked through the lobby, pushed through the door onto 6th Avenue. New York received me the way it always does, loudly, indifferently, magnificently, completely unconcerned with the private seismic events of any individual human life. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it wash over me. The noise. The October air, cold and sharp the way only New York October air is. The cabs. The people moving in every direction with the focused urgency of a city that has never once considered slowing down. In my inside jacket pocket was a document my accountant had described conservatively as the kind of thing that changes the shape of a life. A 15% stake in a clean energy infrastructure fund that Maurice Parker had spent 4 years building quietly and methodically into something that would, over the next decade, reshape an entire industry. My name on it. Eugene Price, Queens, New York. Retired. Boring. Jordan would rebuild. I know my son. He is stubborn and talented. And underneath the performance, underneath the gala and the microphone and the auction and the pointing, he is the boy I raised, the boy I drove to school in the rain, the boy I sat next to in waiting rooms at 2 a.m, running a fever that scared me more than I've admitted to anyone. He would sit with what happened in that room. He would turn it over. He would eventually, not soon, but eventually, understand it the way it needed to be understood. And when he was ready, I would be in Queens, where I have always been. Walked to the subway, went home to Queens, made myself a cup of coffee, sat in my kitchen, and for the first time since a Friday night on Park Avenue, when my own son held up a microphone and offered me to a room full of strangers for $1, Eugene Price felt exactly, completely, and without apology like himself. Not boring. He was never boring. He was just quiet. And the thing about quiet men, the thing Jordan Price was only now beginning to understand, 43 floors up in a conference room, on 6th Avenue with Mitchell Green's eyes on the table and Maurice Parker's words still in the air, is that quiet is not the same as absent. Quiet men see everything. Quiet men remember everything. And quiet men, when they finally decide the moment has arrived, when they button their jacket and pick up their old leather briefcase and walk out of a room they have just rearranged completely, quiet men do not look back. They don't need to. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.